Start the recording. Okay, then we can start.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Inès Bakhtaoui. I am a researcher. I work on a project with the Stockholm Environment Institute, ECAD, represented by Nusrat here, the Prakriti Resource Center with Prabin, who's here, and Enda Energy with Emmanuel and Delaney, also in this panel. On the project related to loss and damage finance, and specifically with them on performing a locally led needs assessment of loss and damage finance at the local level with communities in Nepal and in Senegal. And we're here today to talk about the work that we're planning to do this year, the methodology, and to exchange with you on methodological points. So what's on the agenda? So first, we will give an overview of the methodology for locally led needs assessment, a general overview that encompasses both the work that will happen in Nepal and in Senegal, given that these are two different locations with two different specificities and types of climate impacts that they face. So there are differences in how the methodology is apprehended there. And then you'll get to have an overview of what is happening specifically in those two locations. So Prabin will be presenting the case of sudden onset events, how we apply the methodology in Nepal. And then Emmanuel from Enda Energy will present this case of slow onset event and how the methodology is applied in Senegal. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session and discussion of 20 minutes where we can exchange on areas where we would love to hear your inputs. So about the methodology, what do we want to do with this project? There are three things that we'd like to do. The first one is to identify losses and damages, both economic and non-economic, that have incurred within a set of impacted communities that we have pre-identified. The second is to estimate the total cost of the damages borne by the communities by quantifying the losses and damages that have incurred, and to identify finally the type of activities that they want and they need to implement to recover from those impacts and to recover from those losses and damages. And that will be used to build evidence to advocate for funding needs, both in terms of amount, so how much funding is needed, and medium, how that funding should be dispersed and under which condition. And we're willing to have our results impact both national financing systems and international financing systems, since, as you may know, loss and damage finance is a topic that has gained traction at the international level, and that now bilateral countries are starting to fund loss and damage. And within the UNFCCC, a fund dedicated to loss and damage has recently been created and is in the process of being designed. A few conceptual elements for our research. First, what do we mean when we talk about loss and damage? We are talking about the capacity of people and their community to withstand, recover, and prosper after the disruption. So there are three levels of recovery that we consider in this process. There's first surviving the impacts, the climate change impacts, then there's recovering from it, and it means a process of reconstruction, rehabilitation, and finally it goes beyond, and it means also thriving. And in that sense, we acknowledge that climate change itself is not sufficient for a community addressing climate change is not sufficient for a community to thrive, but you have to also look at underlying sources of vulnerability that come from power imbalances, that come from income inequalities, that come from political instability, et cetera, et cetera. The second point is that while we focus on long-term recovery and prosperity, so looking at the after loss and damage, addressing loss and damage after it has occurred or while it is occurring, we also recognize that there's a need to integrate also adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and disaster relief actions. And that is part of the activities that we consider in what can be implemented through loss and damage finance. And finally, we want to insist on the locally led dimension of our project, since we're building a methodology around the priorities, needs, and specificities of the affected communities that we work with, and that they are involved in every step of the design of the methodology and their implementation, and they are the first source of information and decision ultimately. I also wanted to mention that the methodology we have developed is inspired by the work that has been done by ActionAid, CAN South Asia, ADRRN, and the APN, which is a methodology for community-led assessments of climate-induced loss and damage. It's called the Loss and Damage Handbook. And we have used this as a first basis to develop what we're going to present today, but then adapted it for our own needs. And I will give a quick overview of the stages. So there are three main steps. There's the first one, which is to design the methodology itself, and that requires a review of literature and document analysis to understand the local context and existing methodologies. And then once there's a first version, there's consultations with stakeholders. It's the occasion to do a mapping of stakeholders, to present that methodology to them, get their feedback, integrate it so that they agree on the methodology. The second phase is about identifying climate impacts, identifying losses and risks and areas of vulnerability through several rounds so that is point 3, 4, and 5, which is mapping of material risks and incurred losses and damages, a participatory vulnerability and capacity assessment, and an identification of impacts of financial and non-financial needs. And finally, the last step is the quantification and the application of those findings. So it's about putting a number on what those losses and damages cost and what actions are required to mitigate them and how much those actions potentially cost. So that would be the data processing and gap analysis. We also do a quantification of needs through surveys. Our other panelists will present that further. And finally, presenting the results back to the population, getting their approval on everything, and working with them in how we take those results into real life for advocacy and for actually getting funding. So I mentioned the literature review. There are two different types of documents that we consider. The first one is about understanding the context within the country in which we're working in terms of climate change, in terms of existing strategies to mitigate, adapt, and address climate change, and about projects and plans that exist to fund activities related to that. So that's about understanding the context and identifying communities that we want to work with. And the second part is literature on needs assessment methodologies to understand what needs to happen, what methodologies we can develop. And once we have done that, as I explained, we report back we approach the communities, we map stakeholders to understand who we're working with, making sure that we have a representative, that we have links with community representatives. That includes local government representatives, religious representatives, but also making sure that we are also talking with particularly marginalized community members. So that includes ethnic or indigenous minority groups, women and gender minorities, religious minorities, LGBTQ plus members, members with disabilities, homeless members and slum dwellers, migrants, refugees, etc. And the idea is to have a representative sample of the society, of the community we're working with, and to present the results of the literature review that we've done and the methodology, to get their feedback and to build the final methodology with them. And once the methodology is finalized, we get into the implementation phase, and I will hand over to Zoha to present this.
Thanks, Ines. Hi, everyone. I'm Zoha. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. So starting with step 3, which is more of an implementation side, and it starts with a mapping exercise of material risk and incurred losses and damages. So this really starts with essentially having a map of the area and getting community participants to really map the areas that have historically been affected by losses and damages and that they feel might be at risk or most vulnerable in the future as well. This is also paired with an analysis of the historical data as well as future projections on slow onset and onset events and what their impacts have been. And then in case of slow onset events, you might also have something like a seasonal risk calendar exercise where you look at the calendar and look at, specific days in which there has been less rainfall that farmers have seen, for example, or that might have affected their crops over longer periods of time. So all of this allows us to then identify, together with the communities, the areas that are most at risk from climate-induced loss and damage, both historically and ongoing in the future. Next slide. And then building on that, we would do this participatory vulnerability and capacity assessment, where we essentially have the same maps with the risks mapped onto them, to then look at the ability to actually respond to and deal with those risks. So, and therefore also identify the material resources that are most vulnerable as a result of those risks. So, we would give something like sticky notes to participants to actually identify the resources that they have available to cope with losses and damages, such as infrastructure, hospitals, community centers, and other institutions. Identify areas where there might be particularly vulnerable communities residing that would be most affected by losses and damages, for example. Identify the specific areas that they depend on for resources or for their livelihoods, such as fisheries or cultural lands, and then other areas that might depend on for their well-being, so social and cultural spaces as well. So that would give us this identification of all the different resources available and the areas most at risk as well at the same time. Next step. And so then once you have the mapping, we then go on to dig further in depth through more engagement with communities, because the mapping really only gives you information on material risks. But of course, we know that, or material impacts, but we know that there are a lot of other impacts beyond that, such as non-economic or psychological impacts related to loss and damage as well. And there might be specific resources that cannot be placed on a map, for example, or aren't related to space. And so as part of this, we propose first doing these key informant interviews with the responders groups. So with local governments, development partners, national governments, other local NGOs, for example, that are more focused on the responding side. And they would, and those interviews would, provide some information on the types of support that is already available to respond to loss and damage, and what has been lacking, and what financial and technical resources they are able to access, for example, and what from the international community or more nationally, and what hasn't been available to basically provide an area, provide some analysis of the gaps that might be there. And then we also propose doing focus group discussions with members of affected communities, ensuring representation across the different marginalized groups that we identified, to really get some insights on what specifically was lost and damaged historically. So in the case of a sudden onset event, you would be looking at a historical event and then doing a loss and damage needs assessment following that. In the case of a slow onset event, it would be kind of more ongoing. So yeah, what these specific impacts were, what recovery resources and support were available in the case of a historical event, for example, what are the specific needs that or specific activities that they feel would need to be funded by loss and damage finance that aren't currently covered through existing streams such as humanitarian aid or adaptation support, for example. So yeah, what they feel was left unfunded. Step. So once you have all this information, basically combine the mapping exercises with the more qualitative data and then go on to do a quantification of the needs. And here we're proposing doing this at 2 different levels, depending on the objective of the methodology. But at the household or community level, you would administer a household survey where you target particularly vulnerable households that were identified through the mapping exercises, and basically have, you know, a list of questions to identify what specifically was lost and damaged. You know, how many cattle did they lose, how much crops did they lose, things like that, and go through the survey that way for economic losses and damages. For non-economic losses and damages, it would be a little bit more complicated in terms of doing the quantification, and we're keen to hear from others and whether they have any ideas or insights on how to do this. But you know, we would start by looking at the specific resources amounts spent to deal with losses and damages that are non-economic, for example, and then go beyond that to see what cannot be quantified. So that's at the household level. Then at the regional or municipality level, we'd also do a desk-based assessment of existing records and budgets to look at, you know, what the recovery and rebuilding costs were, how much of them were able to be covered through existing support, and what was not covered and is still requiring support. So then you take all of this information and you would do a gap analysis of the total impacts and the needs at the household and regional level, and then you compare that with the resources and support that were available to respond, and that would give you some kind of quantification of or estimate of what potentially was left unfunded, and therefore what additional support is required to address the full spectrum of losses and damages, and also some insight into what that funding could support, what specific activities it could support. And then finally, the next step, I realize I'm running out of time, is to develop this locally led response plan and dissemination, where you have an additional half-day workshop with stakeholders to identify you know, priority actions that could be taken to respond to losses and damages at the local level, and develop some solutions together that the international community could fund through the new loss and damage fund, for example, so that it's not, you know, externally dictated priorities being funded, but something that is really locally determined. And then you'd also have this kind of advocacy or lobbying exercise that, you know, enables community members to really disseminate their needs and priorities and information to the responders group that I had mentioned. So that's about where we are. It's kind of generic, but we do have more contextualized versions of this in our 2 case studies. And so I'll hand over to Pravin, who is here to speak a little bit about how this would work in Nepal.
Thank you, Joha and Ines, for a very detailed presentations on the methodology that we have collectively developed over the last couple of months. I don't have a presentations, and actually I don't have much to add as well, but I will be supplementing on some of the Nepal specific points on the methodology that we have developed. So the methodology that Joha and Ines has presented, we are applying this methodology in a sudden onset disasters. As you know, Nepal is prone to the floods, and in the recent past, both the scale and the magnitude of floods has intensified in last 2 decades here in Nepal. So we are taking a case of a flood in 2021 in the Melamchi region. So the area was hit by a massive flood that was not witnessed in that area as reported by the local communities in last 100 years. In fact, that area was not prone to floods till the incidents that happens in 2021, except some small floods that recurring floods, small floods, but the scale of flood that was hit the area in 2021 was quite massive. And 2 municipalities were affected, the Helambu and the Melamchi. So these 2 municipalities will be our field sites for this study. And as per the government records and as per the initial consultations with the community, the floods in 2021 has caused human casualties, damage to house, community buildings and hospitals, local infrastructures like bridges, roads, loss of land, arable, especially the big part of the land that was lost were the agriculture land, and loss of crops were also reported, loss of businesses, loss. So apart from these economic type of loss and damage, there were loss of aquatic biodiversity, because the river used to be rich in the fish, especially in the fish biodiversity. So that was also reported, and similarly, the forest, loss of agricultures and religious sites such as temples. And as you know, since it's been 2 years when the floods has hit, still the many peoples are living in the temporary shelters and waiting for the proper rehabilitations from the government side. So not all has received the compensation amount that the government has guaranteed or government has pledged immediately after the floods. So there are lots of human sufferings or that has been reported. So these are some of the initial sort of findings that we had gathered from the literatures and also from the community consultations that we have made. So on this context, so we have developed a methodology. Basically, our methodology is designed to capture both economic and non-economic loss and damage caused by the floods in 2021 in the Melamchi region. And the methodology, our part of methodology will be the ex-post analysis, meaning that the assessment of loss and damage will be done after the climate-induced disaster hit. So we will be assessing the loss and damage that has been actually occurred by the disasters, by the floods. So that's the part of analysis that we are looking. This is slightly different from what Emmanuel is going to be present as a part of his presentation. So on the methodology side, I think the lots has been explained by Joha and Ines, but there are 2 specific parts in the methodology. The first part of the methodology is on the assessment of economic and non-economic loss and damage. So for that assessment, we will be the methods that we are adopting, as already explained by Joha and the Ines, is the household survey, participatory capacity vulnerability assessment tools, key informant survey. So these are some of the methodology that we are be using in terms of particularly on the economic side. And for the non-economic side, we will be using the case studies of the peoples who has been a disaster survivors and who has been suffering to live in a very undignified conditions since last 2 years. So this is how that's the first part of our methodology. And second part of our methodology is on the funding requirements for addressing the loss and damage. Again, this has been already shared by Joha in her presentations, but in case of Nepal, what we are trying to do is that we are working on we will be identifying the proposed local-led solutions to address loss and damage. So that's the first step. And secondly, we will assess the resource availability. What are the current resource flow and financial flow in those areas in the name of the humanitarian assistance or as adaptations works or development works. So those resources will be assessed. And finally, we will identify the gaps in the resources, what is required to address the proposed loss and damage, to address the local-led solutions and what is already available. So briefly, that's on our second part of the research. Finally, I welcome any questions and feedbacks on the methodology. Since we are still developing the methodology, we are almost in the final stage, in fact, and we are planning to start the field works from the next month. So any critical inputs, insights, or the feedback on the methodology that Joha presented or I have just shared with you, we will be happy to take them. With that, let me stop and I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pravin. That was a really nice and concise overview of the case study. I'll hand over to Emmanuel and their team now to speak about Senegal.
Thank you very much. I thank you for the presentation you have made on our behalf that summarize very well the different steps that we identify for our methodology, particularly in Senegal. Just to remind that related to the issue of loss and damage, it was really important for us as a prerequisite to bring the issues on the common understanding. That means to look at the loss and damage, particularly in the angle of the UNFCCC. I mean the convention on climate change, and related to the issues of loss and damage in this framework. We'll say that it will be good to look at the slow onset events. And the slow onset events that are prominent in Senegal is mainly as a coastal countries, the sea level rise, the rise of temperature, the salinization of land, and the desertification and the loss of biodiversity. And related to these slow onset events, we've seen that the effect of the sea level rise is really affecting or threatening many communities. I mean the coastal communities. And based on that, we said it will be good to identify those who were affected by the sea level rise, for example, in the north of Senegal, and those who may be affected by the sea level rise. So we are looking at the things ex ante, but also to prevent, because that is a kind of solution that we may have or learn from what happened in the communities that were affected. And then, as Ines and Zoa have said, we had a consultation with communities to allow them to take ownership of the methodology that we developed, and also to better identify the effect of the sea level rise in their communities, and to find also the solution, or to identify the solution they have already provided, because we should not forget that in these communities we have the local know-how. I mean the practice that they are developing in the fields, and that may help, for example, to cope or to deal with the coastal erosion. So many things was already said by Zoha and Ines, but based on these issues, what we find are relevant, particularly in this session, is to look at together how to assess, for example, the non-economic losses, because we face with some difficulties of really quantifying the non-economic loss. And what we propose as an approach is to look at the effect of the climate change or the sea level rise within the household, because you will agree with me that it is the sea level rise are not impacting in the same manner those who are in the coastal or in the border of the rivers or the ocean, that those who are 200 or 2,000 meter of the coast. Then it's really be good at least to have some interview with these communities to look at how they are really affected, and based on that to not only quantify the damage, to see how the reparation could be done, but also in terms of support, because we have to remind that there are some institutional measures that are taken by the government in terms of supporting those communities. We can say related, for example, to the north of Senegal, for those who know the countries, that there are some communities that were displaced from the district, I mean the coastal areas, and they are far from the beach or the sea. And we can, when we had the discussion with them and even the consultation, they say that their condition are totally different with what they had in the past, and they would like to come back where they were. But we may agree that when you have your house damaged, it is difficult for you to really develop your activities. So there is this approach on focusing in the households. There is the approach also on focusing in the communities to see, based on the different sector, particularly the fishing sector, the processing, the fish processing, what kind of solution or infrastructure that may be built to protect these communities. And with them, we assess the needs first, based on the solution that was provided, because with this solution, there are some limits in terms of building protection for the household, in terms of also impacting in terms of reducing the effect of the coastal erosion. So this is a fact. And we will continue interacting with the communities, particularly to look at the mechanism in terms of financial support that could be set up, because there is until we had this session, we did not find a mechanism that may help urgently these communities. I mean the urgent or emergency funds, emergency mechanism that may support communities when a disaster will come. And I think we need this kind of mechanism, not only at the local level, but as it was said during the conference of parties, international mechanism that will support the loss and damage issues. But this will need to be aligned or linked with the mechanism at the country level, I mean at the national level, but particularly where the disaster happened at the community level. So as we said, we will deepen the research to come with some findings that we think will help in assessing, for example, the needs in terms of finance at the international level. But because I'm not sure that we really have an assessment of the financial needs of loss and damage at the country level and but at the international level. And I think the activities or the exercise that we are doing will contribute to that, but also to help the communities to really have the resources, I mean the financial resources to make impact, but to cope with this disaster. Particularly the focus that we have is related to the sea level rise. That's made difference with the Nepal case, which is focused on floods, but to reiterate that we are doing the assessment ex post, but also ex ante, not only to prevent, but to allow the community to have some reparation when a disaster comes, particularly related to the sea level rise in the north of Senegal, and also in the other parts where the sea level rise is affecting communities. And the last that we add in this exercise is to look at the issue of salinized land, because we know that it is affecting a lot the Salum Delta, about the agricultural productivity. But at the end, what we are looking, it's not only for community solutions, but also to have to be sure that the resources, financial resources that are gathered for the loss and damage really flows to the communities to make some impact. And for that, we need to be sure that the mechanisms are already set up there to channelize the resources in an adequate way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think we are right on time, which is nice. And I will share that we had some discussion questions. But I think we can also open the floor now to any questions for any of the panelists as well. But just to go through some discussion questions, so this is still very much a work in progress, and I think we wanted to also emphasize that we see it as a very much an iterative methodology, and that we will not have, like, you know, a final document that is that summarizes our approach, but something that is continually co-produced and developed through our engagement with the community. So, you know, as we're implementing the different stages, if we find that something needs to change or certain approach is not working, then we would, you know, adapt it according to that. So we very much see it as a living methodology in that way. And so we're keen to also get feedback from you on what we've shared. So, you know, whether you have any more insights on different quantification approaches to both economic and non-economic losses and damages, and capturing these more, you know, non-material and value-based needs, and how we can quantify those, and how to really ensure like the proper or thorough engagement of different communities, particularly marginalized communities for different groups, and how their intersectionalities might affect their marginalization, and how so we can, you know, develop plans that really are inclusive and collective of all of these different community groups as well, and to ensure that responses to loss and damage are also inclusive, and that finance actually reaches not only the elites in a certain population, for example. And whether you have any thoughts on how these insights could feed into the ongoing loss and damage finance negotiations. I did see in the chat that Linda had raised the question about how this could feed into the work of the TC. And I think it'll be interesting. Our timeline is actually to have this finalized before the COP, so to have a publication by the end of the year. But since our case studies will already start from next month and go on into the summer, we're hoping that at least for the second and third TC meetings, we might be able to share some preliminary insights or findings from the work. But yeah, opening the floor now to any inputs, questions. Feel free to raise your hand or come in directly.
A question for the moderators at ECAD. Are the people attending able to take the floor, actually, to turn on their mics?
Yeah, so the attendees need to raise their hands and we'll allow them to talk.
Great, thanks. Don't be shy. we're really keen to hear your comments, your ideas, and your questions if you have any, or you can also type them in the chat.
I know, I see a hand.
Maybe that we can also ask them their views in terms of loss and damage, how they understand it, because the challenge we've had is to be focused in terms of loss and damage at the country level. The humanitarian are working on loss and damage, but not specifically those who are linked to climate change. And then after the solution that they have and how they could support the exercise we were doing.
There is a hand. Jackson from Uganda wants to comment.
Thank you so much for the good presentations. Jackson from Uganda. I work with Oxfam. I'm the Climate Justice Coordinator, Oxfam in Uganda. And loss and damage in Uganda is still an elephant in the house. We are still grappling on how we can even define loss and damage, but also the quantification of loss and damage is still a big challenge. I'm happy to hear that in your specific countries, you've been able to do that, because even modalities of financing, I don't know modalities of financing, whether these modalities are both international modalities of financing, or you're also able to mobilize domestic modalities of financing loss and damage. It's something that we're still grappling with and would like to learn from other countries how this is done. Thank you so much for those presentations.
Thank you so much for your input, and I'm glad that the work seems interesting, and you know, we really want to produce something that can be replicated in other country contexts as well. I think we're primarily focusing on, I mean, we had not identified a scope of the different modalities, but I think the idea is that, you know, even when the loss and damage fund is operationalized at the international level, it might, you know, channel funding through already existing national level mechanisms and modalities rather than establishing something new, or it might establish something new. We don't know yet, but the idea is to really have synergies and also make sure that we're not, you know, creating something from scratch, but also using already existing local and national systems to the extent that they work or are fit for purpose to channel finance to those who might need it. I don't know. Anyone else has thoughts on that?
If I may, I think it speaks to the last part of the methodology, which is about the advocacy and what you do with those findings once you have assessed the amount. And so I think Emmanuel already touched on that a little bit, that it's important to feed the results within the UNFCCC context, but also looking at mapping the existing, that was Pravin who talked about mapping the existing funding resources that exist. So I'd be keen to hear what you have to do, what you plan to do in Nepal and in Senegal, in each case, when it comes to different sources of funding, international, national, local, and the residual funding when there's not enough available through those channels.
So I don't know if Pravin would like to come, or Pravin?
Emmanuel, okay. Well, still, this is relatively a new part for us as well, because, as you know, the funding informations were not quite readily available. So what we are trying to look at is that basically in Nepal, what we have a provision is that the government of Nepal, once the disaster hits, they will pledge some support. Actually, there are some standards developed by the government of Nepal to compensate the disaster survivors in terms of their losses. Like if a person is died, by the disasters, the certain amount was there in the policies to compensate the losses. And similarly for the houses and some other form of the some other and other forms of the losses. So we will try to what we are planning to do is that we will try to assess whether those funds that has been there in the as a part of government policies were actually reaching to the communities, right? And what are the barriers in terms of communities to access those funds. So that's there. And apart from the government stream of funds, the another stream of funds that will go outside the government is from the development partners. And as we have been reported that after the disaster hits in 2021, some of the development partners like Swiss governments and even UNDP, so they had supported the communities in terms of their response and the rehabilitation works. So we will try to track down those informations and try to see what are the available resources in terms of what the communities are receiving. So we cannot say that we are getting all the figures from those sources, but still we can have an indicative sort of figures, finance figures in terms of how much government is putting in terms of response and recovery, and how much the development partners, because all this money has to go through the local government systems in Nepal's case, because none of the development partners or the government money can go beyond the local government, beyond the reporting of the local government. So we are hopeful that once we visit and interact with the local government, we are getting those informations from the local governments, two of the local governments, and try to have an indicated sort of a funding available for the post-flood response and recovery. So that's what we are thinking of as of now. But definitely one of the challenges that we have witnessed even in our earlier work on climate finance tracking, apart from the this is like a regular sort of a climate finance adaptation mitigation tracking, is that the informations were not available. If it's available, people are not really willing to give those information. So those sort of challenges will be there. But our initial thoughts in terms of getting the financial informations are from some of those sources that I have explained. So as we progress with this research, we will update you, the research team, in terms of what are the further challenges and what are the success that we have. So that's my take on those. Yeah, thank you.
So I would like to add, referring on the issues that we are dealing with. I mean the coastal erosion and the sea level rise. There are some resources that are mobilized at the country level. We can say that we have the rescue organization plan for emergency that is already existing in Senegal. But with the exercise we are doing, we have noted or observed that more resources are allocated for emergency issues or humanitarians. Could we say that that is loss and damage issues? Yes, because if you look at the teams or the issue that affect the communities, it can be allocated to loss and damage because it is sea level rise and coastal erosion, and even some adaptation programs, because Senegal have the first adaptation fund project was adaptation to coastal erosion in vulnerable areas in Senegal. So the limit between adaptation and loss and damage is sometimes very tricky or very tight. So the exercise that we are doing will allow us to know at least what should go to lessen damage, what remain at for humanitarian, what should go to for adaptation. But frankly speaking, it will be a bit difficult. But what we are looking here is, yes, if we understand that the issue related to loss and damage, one of them or those who are part of them are sea level rise, rise of temperature, salinization of land, and we have this same understanding. We could say that the resources that is allocated to this these issues may be loss and damage. But for now, the exercise is to identify what should go to humanitarian, adaptation, loss and damage, which is not an easy task. But I think we may help also the transitional committee, because the work we are doing is to inform also at the international level on the different criteria for supporting the loss and damage at the country level, which is not, I think, a task which is already done. But at the country level, what we would like is at least at the local level, working with municipalities, that we have this kind of funds that go directly with the loss and damage issues, if it can be, and for the support from the country at the national level to be channeled there, because we should help also the municipalities to enhance the emergency plan.
Thanks, Emmanuel and Pravin. I think that was really useful to have more contextualized information on the different national systems available and how you plan to assess them. I thought to wrap up, we might ask, since the ECAD team has been doing some great work on non-economic or value-based losses and damages, whether you have any insights or learnings already that you could share that might be relevant for our methodology. Nusrat or Seifi or anyone else has any thoughts on that, it would be really helpful for us.
Hi, hello, thank you, Zoha. So on the non-economic part, we're actually developing a different kind of methodology which we're we're reframing non-economic loss and damage as to value-based approach towards loss and damage, because the way we are trying to put values on the non-economic aspects is through how the communities, which aspects of the non-economic factors do they value the most? For example, what kind of cultural aspects do they put? We put it in a kind of a Likert scale as to what is more important to them, because it varies according to individuals as well as context. So a different kind of indigenous group will hold a different value for a particular thing that maybe another group of people will not have. So we're trying to develop a new kind of methodology towards it. So maybe I can share the concept that we had developed, and we have a blog on it so that everyone can maybe take a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nusrat. And yeah, I think it would be a great resource to share in the chat and for people to look into. It's a very innovative and meaningful decision to look into, to stop separating non-economic from economic and say that what matters eventually is the priorities that people give to things and the values that these choices depend on. I really like this way of looking into things, which I think is a lot more holistic and recenters the locally led aspect of the work. Yeah, unless anyone has any other question, it might be time to wrap up. So I would like to thank all of you for attending the session. Thank you so much to our.
Sorry,
Yes,
can we maybe do a quick group photo before we end the
of
call
course.
with all the panelists?
Yes.
Can everyone turn on their videos? Yeah, great. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.
Great. Thank you so much, Nusrat. So as I was saying, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Emmanuel, Omar, and Delaney from ENDA. Thank you to Prabin from PRC. Thank you, Zoha, for co-facilitating with me and SEI for supporting this work. Thank you so much to ICAD for organizing the Global China Conference and for welcoming us today to present our work. And once again, thanks to everyone who came and attended and participated in those conversations. And I hope to keep the conversation going with you all.
Thank you for the opportunities given to
Thank-
improve our work. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ICAD. Thank you, Nusrat.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.